Okay, we're recording, guys. Class, you guys know who this is. Who is this?
Dr. Meldrum.
Okay, Dr. Meldrum, this is my fifth grade class at Sterling Heights Elementary. I think I've already told you, just for the recording for the parents and all, we're in Okinawa, Japan. We're on Kadena Air Base, so we're basically the school system for the kids of active duty military and the civilian component that works with us. These kids, they're tough kids. They're military kids. They move around a lot more than a lot of kids in the States, but there's actually been studies done that shown that they're a lot more resilient because of that. Now, did you get the questions we sent?
I did, yeah.
So they are in the process of their final research persuasive. Oh, okay. Looks like Dr. Shears may be joining us. Okay, until she's able to get on. They have to do a persuasive/research writing. All year they've been presented evidence for and what I could find against the existence, which against it's a lot harder to find. Seems like there's a lot of evidence against it. It just seems a lack of recognizing the evidence that does exist. And so they're going to do that. They're going to present, and they've been using a lot of references. Your book, Sasquatch Meets Science, I've read parts of it to them. They've watched some of the documentaries, a lot of different stuff. There's many casts in the back and a whole wall in the back. Probably see part of it back there. But do you want the students to? Do you want to read their questions or say their name and they say their questions?
Yes. Well, why don't I do that, and then I can kind of jump. There's some repetition, and there's some that maybe have a more logical sequence. One will segue with another. So how about if I do that?
Okay. If you can just let the kids know your background and all. And
yeah, I can do that.
All right. Thank you.
Well, hey, I can certainly relate to moving around. My dad worked for Albertson's grocery stores, and we moved every 2 to 5 years. And so I can remember that, going to a new school and meeting new kids and a new neighborhood. And so it really does. It helps, it kind of shapes you up, and you never take anything for granted and always have to be outgoing and engaging to make new friends and get familiar with new places. So I can appreciate that. As a result, I lived all over the Pacific Northwest, mostly, and Intermountain West of the United States, and we grew up spending a lot of time in the outdoors, camping. Was an active Boy Scout at the time, and we did lots of outdoor activities, and I was fascinated with everything related to biology. From an early age, I had an insect collection. Was always bringing animals home, sneaking them into my bedroom. My mom caught me, stopped me at the door one day with a full-size grocery bag, and she said, "What's in the bag?" I opened it up. It was half full of garter snakes, just right. She let me bring one in. That was it. She was pretty tolerant otherwise, though, of all of my things. But I was fascinated, especially with primates and prehistory, dinosaurs and cavemen, Ice Age megafauna, and so all those things kind of wrapped up into one package when I had a chance to go see the Bigfoot film, the Patterson-Gimlin film. One of the first showings of that film was in Spokane, Washington. Some of you have made around through there. Fairchild Airport base is there, and we used to always watch the B-52s fly over on their rounds. But one of the first showings of the Patterson-Gimlin film was there in Spokane at the Coliseum. So I was actually in fifth grade when I first saw that film, my first exposure to Bigfoot, to Sasquatch, and obviously it made an impression, because here I am all these years later. My career ended up taking me into anatomical sciences with an emphasis in physical anthropology. So I'm not a typical anthropologist. I'm more of a comparative anatomist, functional morphologist, but with a particular interest in primates and early human ancestors. And of course, to understand early human ancestors, I do a lot of work on modern human subjects as well, and particularly the way they move. And one of your questions is asking about bipedalism. We'll come back to that, because that's one of my areas of expertise, is the anatomy, the function of our bodies for walking on 2 legs instead of 4. So let me start though. One of the questions that I usually always get asked right at the beginning of an interview with a reporter or a documentarian is this question that, let me get it right here, where was it? Madeline Sullivan asked, why do you believe in Bigfoot? And I want to qualify that because, you know, I'm often asked, well, do you believe in Bigfoot? And I come back and say, well, no, I don't. And it usually catches the reporter off guard that you don't. And I said, it's not a matter of belief. When we talk about belief, it usually suggests a position of faith, which some would define as accepting something in the absence of conclusive evidence. All right? I don't believe in Bigfoot. I'm convinced on the basis of evidence that there's a very good possibility that such a species exists. I don't know for sure. We don't have the conclusive evidence to demonstrate that for sure. And I'm not trying to convince my colleagues or other people that Sasquatch exists. Rather, I try to encourage my colleagues to have an open, objective mind and look at the evidence, weigh the evidence in spite of any preconception, any prejudice that they might have. I had one of my anthropology colleagues who didn't say it to my face, said it behind my back, but said it to an editor who had invited me to write a paper, and then unfortunately his advisory board rejected it. And when I pressed and asked why was it rejected, the answer was, it can't exist, Bigfoot can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence he thinks he has. That's not a very scientific attitude, in my opinion. So it's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of being convinced by the evidence, weighing the evidence on its own merits. All right, are you able to hear me all right? I'm getting a little bit of feedback, but is it coming through clear on that side?
It's very clear on our side.
Okay, very good. All right, so let me touch on that one that Alexander asked. He said, it's a very good question. Why do Sasquatches walk bipedally, even though they are supposedly related to Gigantopithecus, which supposedly walked on all 4s? How did they adapt to walking bipedally, and why? Well, you know, there still are lots of questions surrounding why humans walk bipedally. What was the actual mechanism, the selection pressure? Was it to see over the top of the grass? Was it to carry tools? Was it to expose less of our surface to the sunlight out there in the savannas where we might overheat from exertion? You know, there's lots of different questions about how that came about. Now, your comment about Gigantopithecus makes a big assumption. Actually, all that we have of Gigantopithecus bones are 2 jaws, the biggest species, the one that would most likely be a possible ancestor. We have 2 jaws and about 1,000 isolated teeth. And we only have those bones because porcupines dragged them into a cave and chewed up the soft spots, you know, the thin bones up here and the roots of the teeth and the dentin inside, but left the very thick enameled crowns. And then they became fossilized in the limestone, in the alkaline environment found in limestone caves. Otherwise, out in the forest, in the jungle, the soils tend to be more acidic, and bones tend to dissolve and teeth tend to dissolve away if they're not completely chewed up by other animals like porcupines and other rodents. even rabbits, even deer, other animals will chew on bone to get the calcium into their diet. So we don't know for sure how Gigantopithecus walked. And it's not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, when you come to the ground, you have a 50-50 chance, right? You're either walking on two legs or you're walking on all four. And when you have a body that's shaped like an ape, which ours is, I mean, our upper body at least, the shape of our thorax, our chest, and our shoulder, you notice we're wide and kind of flat this way, and our shoulder blades are back behind, so that when we reach up, the shoulder blade is at a real angle to our shoulder, or even when we put our arms down in front of us, that's more important. See how the shoulder blade is flat on my back, but my arm's going down. So when you do something like a push-up, that puts some strain on your shoulder joint, strain that your shoulder doesn't like very well. Animals that spend all their time on all fours have shoulder blades that line up with the humerus or the arm bone, so that there's compression rather than shear tendency to go past. All right, that's getting a little technical, but the point simply is that it's probably better than a 50-50 chance that an animal as big as Gigantopithecus probably walked on its hind legs. Okay, so that's a real possibility. Now, Gigantopithecus is one possibility. It's the right size, in the right place, at the right time to be a possible ancestor of Sasquatch. Or if we were over in Eastern Asia, you know, just across the way there into China is our stories of the wild man, the Chinese wild man, the Yeren. Japan actually has some stories of wild men too that are a little bit different. They may actually have been brought over as the Japanese islands were colonized from earlier traditions of hairy wild men on the mainland. But they're essentially identical to Sasquatch in their descriptions. And in fact, I had a chance to go over to China and examine a couple of footprints that had a remarkable feature that was indicative of the way that Sasquatch walked, that was identical. But there's no way they could have known about it. I had only published in English, and this person who found these footprints and made these footprint casts in the Chinese National Park there in Hubei, he didn't know anything about it. He couldn't understand how I was trying to explain the way the foot worked, you know. So anyway, another possibility, however, is that maybe Sasquatch is even more closely related to us than something like a Gigantopithecus or the living great apes, orangutans, gorillas, and chimps. And so, you know, there's this split from a common ancestor where two branches on this tree, one led to the living great apes, and the other led to the early ancestors from which the human lineage arose. And one of the characteristics that distinguished this branch that led to us was the very early appearance of bipedalism, walking on two legs. So some have suggested the fact that Bigfoot looks to walk a lot like us, that maybe it is very closely related to us. And so it's possible it's something like what we would call in anthropology an Australopithecine, which is essentially a bipedal ape, a bipedal chimpanzee. From the waist up, they look very similar to a chimpanzee, but they have these long legs. They have a short, broad pelvis, legs, knees that come in closer to the center of the support of the body mass, and feet that have lost the divergent big toe that look much more similar to our own. And so that's kind of where that comes in. All right, let me go to another one. Now, it was asked, let's see, by several of you, but there were questions about footprints. How many footprints? And that was, is that, am I pronouncing it right? Amaya, I'm sorry. Amaya asked, how many footprints have you found in your career? And let's see, Benjamin asked, how can you tell if a footprint is real or a hoax? Now, again, because of my expertise, the evidence in that scale of investigation, the evidence that is the most weighty for me has been the footprint evidence. That's what really interested me, is when in, 1996, I was taken out into the field by a witness in southeastern Washington state, outside of Walla Walla. And he had just found a line of footprints that very morning. I paid a surprise visit to this person because I'd heard about some of the evidence that he had collected in the field. And coincidentally, it seemed almost too coincidentally, upon my arrival, he announced that he had just found some fresh footprints. Would I like to see them? What would you think? My first thought was, oh, that's a little too coincidental. I was kind of suspicious that he might have, but there's no way he could have known. I mean, I literally showed up on his front porch without even a phone call, just on the chance that I might catch him at home. So we went up into the foothills, and here were these 15-inch tracks. Now, let me show you an example of a footprint. This one's a little bit bigger. This one is closer to 17 inches. Just stabbed myself with a little bristle there. Closer to 17 inches. This was actually found in Washington State, over by the Olympic Peninsula, by a deputy sheriff, very credible witness. They were investigating a report of a disturbance, and they went up there, and the conditions were just perfect. There was a thick layer of mud where the pulverized dust on this logging road had been wet down in the rain. And so the mud just extruded up around and between the toes. And so it's probably one of the most detailed footprints you'll ever see. You can even see some evidence of some of the detailed anatomy, like these two bumps here suggest that there's some arthritis in the joints around the bone here, the fifth metatarsal. It's really an amazing example. And so I had the opportunity to witness footprints under not exactly the same conditions, but very similar conditions. It was a farming access road with very silty soil, very fine, what we call loess, glacial loess. It's almost like flour or talcum powder. So when it gets wet, it turns almost into kind of a clay. And so the footprints were extremely detailed. They were so detailed, I could kneel down and still see the little skin ridge details. Like you have fingerprints on your fingers and the palms of your hands. You may not have noticed, but you also have the same kind of skin on the soles of your feet. And we could take a toe print, and actually it's a little further back on the toe than on the fingertip, but you have whorls and arches and loops down there as well as lots of other details across the sole of the foot. So it was so detailed that I could still see some of that kind of thing. And there were all kinds of features of animation, tension cracks and pressure ridges, and where the toes had slipped and they flexed to grip the soil to get traction. So that's what set it in motion for me. There were probably 35, 45 tracks. We cast, my brother and I, who was with me, our brother was with me, we cast 7 so that we could get an idea of the variation in the expression of the movement from step to step. Now I have over 300 footprint casts in my lab. Not that I cast myself, but most of them are copies of other prints or originals that have been given to me by witnesses that have been collected over the past 50 years. And all over the United States, I have examples from Russia, from China. There's one from Australia that might be the Yowie, which we don't really know what that is yet. And have examples from Southeast Asia, from Sumatra, and where else? That pretty much covers it. And that reminded me, one of the questions someone asked, it was let's see, who was that? Let me give credit. It was, it was Kaylin asked how many footprints that I've made. So we cast 7 footprints at that site. I've witnessed footprints in the field myself firsthand on at least a half a dozen occasions, about 6 occasions. But like I said, over 300 footprints, plus hundreds of photographs. I mean, sometimes the witnesses don't have casting material, or the conditions are such that they can't make a footprint cast. It's on a slope or things like that. It makes it more challenging. There it is. Genelise asked, what's the smallest footprint I've ever seen? Well, here's 2 examples. Get that up where you can see it. You know, they're so small that if I don't hold them by the edges. That's pretty tiny, huh? This one is probably barely able to walk on its own. I mean, it looks like a little newborn, except, you know, your foot would be tiny compared to this, and it has this enormous heel, which is one of the characteristics of the Sasquatch footprints, is their heels are much broader and longer for more leverage, broader to provide more surface area to support the body mass. This one's another one. Let's see, this one was from Washington State, and this one was from Michigan, northern Michigan, way up there by the Great Lakes. Also a very small one. And then I'd have incremental ones that go right on up. And the biggest, let's see, who asked that one? Tried to highlight these. Oh, there we go. What's the largest? That was, if I pronounce it, Layla,
there you go.
Layla Mullen asked what the largest one. The biggest track I have in my collection that I'm confident was credible is 19 inches long. 19 inches long. So about 2 inches bigger than this one, if you can imagine that. You know, it's really something. I'm glad you have some casts on the wall there, because, you know, people that, if all they've ever seen are photos in a book or pictures on TV, when you can actually see up close how enormous these tracks are, not only how long, but how broad they are, it's very impressive, you know. I have a footprint cast of one of the biggest basketball players we've had on campus, and it's so narrow. His heel literally is about half that wide, and you know, his foot is only let's see, what was the length of it? It's probably close to 13 inches, 13 or 14 inches. I think Shaquille O'Neal's foot is up there in the 14 and a half. And his is pretty wide. He's a pretty stocky guy. But I've always wanted to get, I'm sure, these pro athletes that get shoes from their, from their sponsors that have extraordinarily large feet, probably have them custom made. In which case, I'm sure Nike or Reeboks or these companies have molds made of their feet. And I've always wanted to get a couple examples of those to have just to compare and demonstrate in when I'm speaking or when I'm presenting in the public the difference. There are many other differences too. We should maybe talk about that. A Sasquatch foot, I've mentioned that the heel is much broader and longer, so there's more leverage because their foot tends to flex across the midfoot, has a more flexible, you can see that it's flatter than a typical human imprint. It doesn't have a well-developed arch and a well-differentiated ball with a thicker padding up here under the heads of the toes, which is a human adaptation for an arched foot, where the weight rests back here on the heel and mostly out here in the front across the heads of the metatarsals, especially the big toe. Instead, when they walk, the foot tends to flex here in the middle, weight pushes off through the entire forefoot, and all of the toes are pushing off rather than through just the big toe. So the toes look different. They kind of look like a human foot, but the lateral toes are much more similar in size, to the big toe than in a typical human foot. So those are some of the differences that distinguish Sasquatch. Now, someone asked, I'm just looking at what I have here, and how's my time? Okay. Someone asked if there were other kinds of footprints. I can't see it. But here it is, Jason. Jason said that not all the casts have to be foot casts, that there are things like knuckles and handprints or body casts. And you're right. This is one that is really interesting. Let me get this up where you can see it. But notice how enormous that is compared to my knuckles. And if I get the light just right, you can actually almost kind of see, you can run your finger across here. If you look at your knuckle right there, there's what's called a condylar joint. It's like a little barbell. Oh, you have it there, great. It's like a little barbell, yeah. So if you run your finger across there, you can feel those kind of little double, especially on the third digit where it's the biggest, you can actually feel that subtlety of detail. And then notice, if I put my fingers down in this posture, where does my thumb go? It sort of juts up this way. But this one's jutting down this way. So you can actually see, if you look closely on that cast there's the thumbnail. And so why is that? Did the hoaxer get it just backwards? If he was copying a human? Well, in the Sasquatch handprints that we have, there is the indication that the thumb, notice how in the human hand, the thumb is rotated 90 degrees so that it flexes across the palm instead of downward like this, like the other fingers. That's what allows us to oppose our thumb to our other fingers. That's what allows for precision grip. So you can pick up a pin or a needle, or hold a key and turn it. The ape hand, on the other hand, sorry about that. Alternately, the ape hand doesn't have this much rotation. When their fingers flex, the thumb tends to kind of flex down in the same direction. And as a result, they also have less muscle mass right here. This is called the thenar eminence, this drumstick. And in human medicine, if something happens to injure the nerve that innervates those muscles, they atrophy and they flatten out, and the palm doesn't have that contour to it that you see. And guess what it's called? Ape hand. Ape hand. So in the Sasquatch handprints, their hand shows the ape-like condition, not the human. Their thumb is quite long, but it's facing the same direction as the other fingers. So when they flex, it flexes back the same way, just like you see on this cast. Now, isn't that interesting that there would be that correlation across several independent examples of the hand in different postures? But one thing too, it does not show the specializations of the backs of the knuckles that we would see on a gorilla or a chimpanzee that walk on their knuckles, knuckle walking. So that suggests, that Sasquatch doesn't use its knuckles for support, except maybe to, get up from a sitting position or to balance itself, to reach over and rest its hand on the edge of the bank or something like that, resulting in this kind of an imprint. But we don't find trackways that have hand and foot impressions simultaneously in a line of progression. Well, there are some more questions, but do you have, I want to make sure that you can speak up and ask things that you're thinking about or that our conversation has raised for you. Are there any questions you'd like to ask?
Riley.
You could field that.
Tell them who you are first.
Hi, my name's Riley, and my question is, what is the most valuable footprint cast that you found?
The most valuable, that one's hard. It's hard to answer favorite. I mean, there are tracks that I think are significant for different reasons. So this one that I showed you from Washington is remarkably clear and shows that outline and proportions really well. So that's a very good example. There's one
that was cast on the film site where the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot that has this remarkable pressure ridge that indicates the action of the foot, how the foot is flat and flexible, and then how that operates when the Sasquatch is walking. There are some examples, like there's the Bosberg cripple foot example, where this was a singular, rather unique individual that either had a birth defect or a crushing injury to one of its feet, or it could have even been a pathology like a tumor on the spinal cord that causes the tissues of the foot, because there's a neuropathy. The nerves that go down to the foot cause the tissues, connective tissue and soft tissue, to deform. And this individual had a foot that was twisted with two big bumps, bunions, on the outside of the foot, and the toes were hypertrophied and at weird angles. One of them was pushed up out of alignment with the other, so it didn't leave a good impression, just the base of it here. So that's really fascinating because it shows a pathology that most people would not be familiar with, and to incorporate that kind of anatomical detail would just be, incredible. I had an opportunity to give a talk back in Massachusetts at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and I was a guest speaker hosted by the podiatry department, the doctors who work on feet. And so I really could talk technical terms about this anatomy and the possible diagnosis, and with all these specialists. And I left a copy, a set of the right and left foot of this crippled individual. The other foot, the left foot, is normal and healthy looking, and very typical, actually very similar to this one from Washington. And so they still have those on display in the department. Whenever they get new students, he always has the new students evaluate this case and try to describe what might have been happening.
We have copies of both of those foots. So
Oh, do you? Okay, good.
we got them. I
Well,
think.
that's a fascinating one that is just, like there was one researcher, Dr. John Napier, who in his book, he did conclude affirmatively that he thought Sasquatch existed. He thought it was the footprint evidence that convinced him. And that Bosberg cripple foot was particularly compelling. He said he just couldn't imagine someone, even if they had the wherewithal, if they had the knowledge, why would they make an example of a crippled foot and try to incorporate those kinds of anatomical details? And I have to agree. I think, the comments that Mr. Sieber said about skeptics, I think is interesting. It's very tough to prove a negative. How do you prove that something doesn't exist, other than to point to gaps in the evidence, the different categories of evidence? But there are people who are very critical and skeptical. Skeptical, I say skeptical with a capital S, because that's all they do is try to poke holes, and to the point that they are blind to any other interesting aspects of the evidence. Anyway.
We have a question from Jackson that I think the whole class is interested in, on your opinion.
Okay.
Jackson, come over where the camera can see.
Hi, I'm Jackson, and my question is, so I'm pretty sure everyone has watched the Patterson-Gimlin film, but
Yeah.
every film you've seen, have they all had that certain arm swing?
Well, it depends on the circumstances. I mean, she was striding. She wasn't just strolling along. She had a mission. She was going to get from point A to point B as quickly as she could. So, when you walk really fast, you tend to swing your arms a bit more. It's when we're adapted to do that, it helps to prevent our body from rotating each time we swing a leg forward. And so in some of the other videos, you know, the Sasquatch is moving, for example, say more stealthily. And so it's not striding with an arm swinging gait. So it varies with the circumstance, but there are other examples that tend to show a similar kind of motion. In my book, Legend Meets Science, there's depiction of the Memorial Day footage where what we think might be a young female with a juvenile on her back. She's running down across the gap in the trees to avoid being seen by the humans below, I think. And when she runs like this. You know, she runs like we would run. And in fact, it's kind of interesting if you watch closely. Whatever was on her back, and it's a slightly different color, I think it's a young one, an infant, it loses its grip and it starts to slip. And so what does she do? She reaches back, and I'm too closely to see, she reaches back with her one arm and she grabs onto whatever it was, and she still keeps pumping with this one other arm. And then she goes down behind a little bit of onto a flat spot, so you can't quite see her from down below. And as she comes out on the other side, that same arm is up here, and as she drops her arm, she gets 5.5 inches taller. Well, it's the head of the little one that's now climbed up onto her shoulders and has its head sitting on top of her head as she walks and disappears into the trees. But it's the same way, you know, you remember going to a parade with your dad hoisting you up on your shoulders. So if you look at the way gorillas carry their infants, you know, they're up on their backs, and since gorillas tend to have backs that are sloped, the little ones are up on their shoulders, and they put their head on top of mom's head like little periscopes to look around. I mean, it's very similar to the behavior of living apes, or humans, hominoids, let's say, broad sense.
Okay, guys, we've got a few more minutes. Has anyone got one that would really help them with their research? Liv, go on up there so we can see you.
Hi, my name is
Hi.
Liv, and my question is, if you saw Sasquatch, what would you do?
Yeah, well, I would hope, and I think I've thought through that scenario enough times that I would have the composure to, you know, to behave in a way that I could gather as much observation as I could, get as close to it as I dare, you know, and I mean, because you have to, as with any animal, any big animal, you have to show proper deference and caution, just like, you know, going up to a mountain gorilla. You don't go up and misbehave, because he's much stronger than we are. And so I would, you know, try to get as many observations. If I had a camera, my iPhone or something, try to snap the pictures, try to collect the data, and then of course follow up with the proper investigation to get as much trace evidence and physical evidence as possible. But it would be, I think I have caught a glimpse of one. I was up in Alberta, Canada last year, well, actually 2 years ago now. Since I could lose track with COVID, that year slipped by so fast. But I was up in Alberta, Canada, at the invitation of an investigator there, and something approached our camp one night and was vocalized. It was making these whistling, chirping calls and breaking brush as it moved around the camp. But I was trying to see with a night vision binocular, which doesn't give you the best. You know, when you're looking through just one, you don't have any stereoscopic vision.
This morning, so log on to your Google Meets at 8:20. See you then.
And so anyway, it broke through the trees and went across the road. Didn't have any means to record or take a picture of it. But it was, if you imagine the Patty film, imagine her jet black, as she broke out of the shadows and against the lighter colored gravel of the roadbed. That's what I saw. So.
Okay, well, Dr. Meldrum, we're going to have to go in a minute. The first bell's going to ring.
Yes, I understand.
I want to thank you for your time, and I know that these kids, they've been really excited about this. I mean, I don't know what else to say except thank you.
Yeah. You're quite welcome. It's always a delight. And hey, these were some of the best questions that I've been asked, even better than many of the reporters who talked to me. So kudos on that.
Okay, and well, I'll send you a link to the recording of this video, and all the parents have signed off on permissions forms that if you want to post it somewhere, you use it for whatever you need, you have full freedom to do that.
Okay, well, thank you. Appreciate
All
that.
right, guys, what do you say?
Thank you.
Good luck.
All right, thank you very much.
You bet.
Have a good day, sir.
You too. Bye-bye.
How was that, guys?